Let's move on to today's lesson. The first two sessions, the way we will run is that in the first session, which we've already begun, and maybe we might end up going a little bit into the second session, I'm not sure. I will take you through the challenge of Islam. So what I'll do now is I will take us through the slide quickly, and then I will give you the history in a little more detail while you have those dates with you on the screen. First of all, Islam had a beginning in the person of Muhammad, who was born around 570 AD in Mecca. So in one sense, we are still within the first 1,000 years of African church history. Islam became an Arab political religious force bent on subduing the whole world. We will see that in a few minutes as we will come to the details. And then in 639 AD was their first attack in Africa. Okay, so out of Mecca, they then Arabia, then they made their way into Africa through Egypt. We'll see all that in a moment. And then by 710 AD, they had totally conquered North Africa, from Egypt all the way to Morocco or Mauritania. So right across North Africa, the whole place was conquered. And then initially, they were tolerant to Christianity. They were only asking that Christians pay taxes. But finally, they instituted stiffer measures while making Islam more attractive. And so finally, by the 16th century, Christianity was wiped out of North Africa. To a large extent, there were still some remnants of it, but that's where we are. Strictly speaking, therefore, we are covering a period of about 1,000 years. Is it 1,000? Yes, 1,000 years from about the 7th century to the 16th. So about 900 years, Christianity was destroyed in that northern part of Africa. So one of the greatest challenges to the early African church was the rise of Islam. Muhammad was born, as I said, in 570 in Mecca. He was born to a respectable but not wealthy family. His father died when he was still young, and this plunged his family into a period of poverty. He only became financially independent when he married a slightly more wealthy wife. But as a career, he was a camel driver, and that meant that he was moving around quite a lot, from Arabia into Africa, back to Arabia, and so on. And inevitably, because of the amount of movement that was involved in his life, he was exposed to a lot of cultures, both in Arabia and Africa, and he was also exposed to a lot of religions. I think if you've ever traveled around the world, that's the thing that strikes you the most, the variety that is there within human cultures and human religions. So, but he was sincerely seeking for the truth, because not everything that people believe must be true. So what really is the truth? Who is in error. And he was also seeking for the way of salvation because he genuinely believed there is a God, a creator to whom we are accountable. And so he was listening, he was watching, and what hit him the most, negatively speaking, what he was disgusted with, especially among the Arabs, was the amount of idolatry that he couldn't stomach, and the proliferation of gods. As far as he was concerned, there must only be one creator, only one governor of human history who's in charge of all things. Who is he among all these gods? So he was really put off by that. The other thing that put him off was what we would call nominal Christianity. Okay, in other words, people who claim to be Christians but are not. And therefore, when you get close to them, you begin to discover that they are immoral, they are full of selfishness, defrauding other people. They're doing so much wrong, but still claiming to be Christian. And so what that did to Muhammad was to make him reject Christianity altogether. He was rejecting not really Christianity, he was rejecting that which was to us today obviously false Christianity. So a time came when he just felt compelled to fight for a monotheistic religion. Okay, one that was for only one true God. And that's what set him off into founding Islam. Around the age of 40, he saw visions. And this is one of the things that we'll obviously come and discuss, were these visions real? Were they figments of his own mind? Was it the devil that was giving him these visions? But his own conclusion was that these were inspired by God, whom he came to recognize as Allah. And therefore, he concluded that Allah was ordaining him to be a prophet, and specifically to teach the religion that there is only one true God. That was back home in Mecca. And so he began to preach that there is only one true God, and his name was Allah, based on the visions that he had seen, and that the idolatry that made up so much of Arabian life must be destroyed. Now, trust me, the moment you take away a man's job, he will want to slit your throat. So the priests, the Arabian priests, did not take this lying down. And so they fermented trouble for Muhammad until he had to run for his life. And so in the year 622, Muhammad ran off into Medina. He fled for his life to Medina. And that flight, that trip, is still commemorated today by Muslims under the name Hegira, the flight of the Prophet. It's still very much part of their calendar. Well, when Muhammad went, he didn't go into hiding for his life and just sort of decide, okay, this thing hasn't worked, let me forget about it. What instead he did was to continue preaching. In fact, he gained greater success in Medina than he had done in Mecca. He got quite a following, a crowd, largely from among the poor people in Medina. But he definitely got his numbers there. And it was really from there that he then became a powerful political figure. Simply because, as you know, politics is number one about numbers. That's what it is. Get a large crowd and you can do almost anything that you want. And as Muhammad continued preaching and gathering these many people around him, he began to realize that there was only one way in which Islam could then become a force to reckon with worldwide. And it was by turning those same numbers into a religious army, so that they would be armed and therefore go not only to convert through teaching and preaching, but subduing the peoples to Islam. And so it was really from that angle that Muhammad then raised an army and came back to Mecca. Having come back to Mecca, he defeated the rulers of Mecca and then took over Mecca completely. It then became his base, his capital. It became the holy city of Islam. Muhammad spent the next few years concentrating on writing the Quran. And by the time he died, which was in 632, he had finished writing that holy book. I'm amazed to think that he was only about 62 years old when he died, which is roughly 2 years older than I am. Well, by the end of this year, I'll be 61, so it will be really a year older than myself. And to imagine what he did, I was sitting thinking in my room that to imagine, I mean, Christ had his major change in 3 years, right? But he's God. To imagine myself dying next year and having come up with a completely new religion, taking over an entire city, and then from there, taking over the world. Yeah. He obviously achieved something. Well, by the time he died, he had left one major thought in the minds of his followers, and it was this: there's only one God. His name is Allah. And he had one prophet, Muhammad. That's it. So although the Arabs were divided by their different smaller tribes among themselves and all kinds of ethnic differences, this became a uniting force. Okay? One God, Allah, one prophet, Muhammad. And the task was to conquer the world in order to bring those two realities to bear upon everybody. And therefore, they went into this agenda of conquering the world. Initially, in Arabia itself. So they began in the north and conquered Syria, then conquered Mesopotamia, and then conquered Persia, all that taking place there. And then, finally, 7 years after the death of Muhammad, they turned round and now entered into Africa, beginning with Egypt as the first place to conquer. Egypt was, on one hand, the easiest to conquer, primarily because at that point, Egypt was under Byzantine rulers, and they were not in favor of the Coptic Church, which was the primary Christian church in Egypt. That inevitably meant that the colonized people were fighting the colonialists primarily for religious purposes. So when the Arabs arrived, the general population preferred to have the Arabs rule over them than their previous colonialists. And inevitably, the Muslims did what was in their favor. They promised the Christians freedom of religion. In other words, your Coptic church, you would be free to do with as you please. And inevitably, therefore, because the common man preferred freedom, religious freedom, they favored the Arabs, and that's how they defeated the Byzantine rulers and took over Egypt. This took place within a year, so this is now 640 AD. It took them a little longer to go further to reach Carthage, primarily because of the desert that was in between. And so it took them, at least if I can do my calculations here, another 30 years to finally conquer Carthage. And in between was Cyrenaica, which I'll show you a map, by the way, in due season. So by 670 they conquered. It took another 40 years. So we're now reaching 710 for them to reach the extreme end of Africa. And that's how they went from east to west, conquering the lands. The main, if I could use the word enemies, they were really defeating were the pagan tribes, because they were against idolatry. Christians were tolerated, and I will go to deal with that in a moment. And so in that sense, the Christians initially did not resist as much. They didn't really sort of take up arms in order to fight these. I mean, they did to some extent, but it was really the pagan tribes with their idolatry that were defeated and killed, and their places burned, their places of worship burned and destroyed, and so forth. Let me quickly go into this latter part as well. At first, as I said, the Muslims were tolerant to Christianity. And the main thing that they demanded was simply, we are a political force. We are coming in to govern. You are going to be inhabitants of this land. You must pay tax, which makes sense. Wherever you are, when you are overtaken by colonial power, you pay tax. And the reason why they did not destroy Christians is because they were themselves people of the book, and Christians were also people of the book. And so they were predictable, like Muslims are predictable. They could read something and obey. And so, in one sense, they found a keenness there. Although Muhammad was opposed to the sense of three persons in one God, because it was understood as three gods, but the Bible spoke in terms of there is but one God. All right, so in that sense, they tolerated the Christians. The only times they fought Christians were in places where Christians were resisting their rule, the rule of the Muslims. Then they ended up fighting them. But by and by, they began to introduce stiffer measures against Christians, what they called the Covenant of Omar. So, for instance, there was the issue of not just paying tax, but paying tributes to the rulers. Number two, enforcing hospitality for Muslims. Number three, Christians were not allowed to build new church buildings. So, fine, you've got your buildings, that's it. No more multiplication. And then also, they were not allowed to put up any symbols of Christianity on their buildings. Now, as you know, the symbol of Christianity from really its beginning was the cross. So they had to bring down these crosses so that the Christian faith was not visible in the community. So they were multiplying these stiffer measures on the people of God, the Christians. On the opposite end, they also made becoming Muslims very attractive. And one way in which they did it was that if you were a Muslim, you didn't pay tax. Now, you know money issues. You didn't pay tax. In fact, it is said that in Egypt, so many Christians, of course in quotation marks, became Muslims that the government went broke. And therefore, they had to reverse that decision and reimposed tax on the people, just so that government could survive. But it was not only the paying of tax, rather the non-payment of tax, that made people convert to Islam. It was that because Islam was largely a social movement, it was a political movement, it took over land, which makes it very different from Christianity. Christianity, you convert people one by one. You speak to a person and you convince that person, and they then make a profession of faith. Islam takes over territory. What it meant is that, for instance, if you wanted a job in government, and you know that government is a primary employer, you then had to be a Muslim. Otherwise, government was definitely out of bounds for you. Number two, if you wanted to marry a Muslim woman, you again had to become a Muslim. Muslims were not allowed to get married to people of any other religion. So that also became an attraction for a number of these nominal Christians who obviously overlooked their own Bibles. Allow me to continue, just finish off this before we take our break. And then also, one reason why Christianity was easily defeated was that, remember, there were those controversies, doctrinal controversies that were continuing, and also there were personal rivalries that were taking place among the bishops. And so instead of working together, they were preoccupied with fighting one another. So that's how the church began to slowly die in North Africa. Whereas in the year 700, there were approximately 30 or 40 bishops across that entire region of North Africa. By the year 1050, there were only 6 bishops remaining, from about 30 to 40 bishops. And by the year 1300, there was only 1 bishop remaining across the whole of North Africa. And so by the time the Reformation was coming, which also was providing fresh missions work into Africa, Christianity had been by and large wiped out by Islam. The Coptic Church in Egypt was still there, except it was extremely weak and barely surviving. So that's what took place, and that's what you've just seen there on that picture. Okay, so that history, if we now go forward another 1,000 years and we come to today, in Africa, Christianity then becomes largely the number 1 religion. Islam is a second number 2. In other words, a lot of missionary activities took place that has reversed the situation. Not north of the Sahara. North of the Sahara, as we know, still remains largely Islamic territory with the Arabs there largely. But south of the Sahara, a lot of activities took place. But again, the possibility of losing ground is there. The missiologists, people who study missions and are sitting in theological colleges and seminaries, have said that by 2050, which is just around the corner, they are doing statistics, that Islam will again be number 1. Hopefully not, because it's just extrapolation. If Christians do their bit, that might not happen. But as they are counting the figures, that's where they are heading. So I have a question to ask, and I'd like you to answer and us to discuss. First of all, would you agree that Islam remains a major threat to the Christian faith? If yes, why do you think so? If no, why do you think so? We are here. We've seen what happened in the first 1,000 years from the year 600, and look at that last line. Okay, I think generally you obviously are knowledgeable enough about Islam to give your answers there, there's been the fact that there are some weaknesses within Islam itself. Those of you who've been in the sort of the Dubai, United Arab Emirates area, you are seeing that obviously it's not quite what the rest of the Islamic world would love to see. So there's something to be said for that. However, I think most of you have put your fingers on the more positive end of Islam being a threat. For instance, you mentioned the fact that it's very well funded because of the oil that is there in the Middle East. And in that sense, it's spreading very deliberately as a kind of missions arm of the religion, whereas the possibility of them, I think the example you gave, Ebenezer, of them not necessarily taking up arms to then start fighting the way they were doing before. I think everybody knows that any nation that attempts that is likely to have a number of other nations ganging up against it. Already Russia is having a tough time to defeat little Ukraine because obviously others are feeding Ukraine from the back door. So that's not the best route to take. I think what they did here is not likely to be what will happen. However, let's still face it that there is some level of aggression, especially in that section where Islam is, maybe let me go backwards, there's a, there's a map that I didn't provide last time. This was basically showing the Western and Eastern Church. So that's your Western Church there. And then you have the Eastern Church there. And remember, I drew a line that was a bit of at an angle, if you remember yesterday. Okay, so that's really where that line can be drawn. And then, of course, you've got your Coptic Church that more or less still holds its sway. Now, the reason why I've come to this drawing or map is right now, if you draw a line here, you draw a line going there, what's happening between the top of that line and the bottom of that line? What's happening? Yes. And what's happening? That's where Christians are being killed, churches are being burnt by Muslims. Every time you hear that there is fighting between Muslims and Christians, it's actually right on that same line. And what's happening is this, that Muslims are losing people to Christianity through conversion because they're being evangelized. Then the imams are getting upset about it, and as a result, they are instructing their people to go to those same churches where their converts are ending up going, and they are burning down those churches. They are killing the pastors. So whereas it's not guns going to take over entire regions, there is still violence there. And you are hearing a lot about it, especially in places on this end like Nigeria, which is sort of half-half, and all the way down to Somalia, and Sudan, in fact, had to end up being divided into half because the conflict was just not ending. And even now, although it's divided, it's still tense. So, although it's true that there may not be the taking up of arms to take over entire countries, unless things really change because of the way nations are functioning, nonetheless, there is that aspect of violence. However, one of you, I think it was Aid, who mentioned that what they tend to do as they go into countries, using their funding, is that they begin hospitals and schools. And then if you are a Muslim, it's free. In fact, they even give you free food and free clothing and free medication. If you're not a Muslim, you pay. And I'm speaking from Zambia. There's been a lot of people converting to Islam primarily because of what Aid mentioned earlier. Especially in the poorer, which is where most of our people are, in the rural areas. You get there and there's this huge mosque, a little bit like that, but not quite, but huge mosque in the middle of nowhere. And then they have got health facilities, and then they also have education. And for the education, as he said, they go for the children, and then they indoctrinate them. Somebody here said that they are intentional. I think it was Israel here. That they are, you can't miss it. That this is something they are doing very deliberately, step by step. So I think we need to recognize that. But also, somebody mentioned political pressure. And this political pressure element is not so much, oh, let's go back where we were. It's not so much this political religious force and so on, but it's for instance, if you go into what we call the Arab North in Africa, you can't just put up a church building. It's almost impossible to do that. You cannot evangelize. It's almost impossible to do that. If anybody reports you that you were evangelizing them, you're out of the country, especially if you were a foreigner. You're immediately kicked out of the country, and so on and so forth. So that's political pressure, which makes what we call the 1040 window one of the most difficult places to reach for Christianity. One of the most difficult. Now, part of it is communism on the extreme end of Asia. Part of it is Islam as you get closer to Africa and in North Africa itself. I really think it would be unfortunate to be learning about Islam in that first 1,000 years period, and then we just move on without realizing that those of you who are now being trained for Christian leadership, that this is something you really have to deal with and consider. I think it was Mike who mentioned this view that is largely marketed, especially in America, that being black means you must be Islamic. Those are the ones who are sympathizers to you, the oppressed black people. Now, come on. It's definitely not true to history. But again, media has this capacity to have its own narrative And that narrative becomes almost impossible to turn around. And even that tends to work in favor of the growth of Islam. And then something else he mentioned, that is aid this time, which is a major cause for the growth of Islam, is immigration and the growth of the family. Actually, Europe right now is almost being taken over by Islam. Not because they are evangelizing, but because they are immigrating into Europe. And then while the Europeans are having one child or two at the most per family, the Muslims are having 10. And then they are marrying multiple wives. So you can see what's happening. And then, of course, the Europeans are becoming anti-Christian. Well, guess what's happening across the road? The Muslims are multiplying, and the dynamics, the demography is just changing overnight over there. 2 or 3 quick points, and then I think we should take our break. Number one, somebody mentioned here, maybe let me begin by putting it a little differently. Are we making the same mistakes that were made in the first 1,000 years? Are we making the same mistakes? One of you talked about divisions. Who was it? I think it was somewhere here. Yeah, Israel, the divisions that we're not thinking collectively. We're thinking primarily in terms of fighting and fighting and fighting. There is something to be said for Christianity is for truth, doctrinal truth, and in that sense we need to fight for the truth, but sometimes we tend to draw the lines a little too tightly to ourselves and then make enemies of those who need not be enemies. We saw that from the first century. Number two is simply the lack of evangelism, intentional evangelism, whereby our churches can be growing purely through culture. Someone mentioned identity. Yeah, they were. Because I'm not a Muslim, therefore I'm a Christian. That kind of thing. Instead of real evangelical conversion, people being born again by the Spirit of God. We can easily have the numbers and then fail in the process. Zambia is a case in point. It's the only country in the whole world where the constitution itself says it's a Christian nation. It's the only country in the world. But hey, it's getting worse and worse morally. But it's supposed to be a Christian nation. Surely that lends itself to a collapse and a final fall when nominalism multiplies. So to the question, what should the church do in order to address this? It's simply doing what God has always told us to do. Okay? And it's in the book here. If we start wanting shortcuts, yes, we might have some bad news coming. And in a sense, it is true. I mean, when Jesus gave predictions or prophecies about the end times, it's not a very encouraging picture. It's not saying, in the end, Christianity will really flourish. It will be, the number one greatest thing all of, no, it says the love of many will grow cold. That's the way he talks about the end.